here. So I wanted to touch on a couple of common themes in our department that are apropos to the address today. First being community-oriented and driven research, which ties knowledge production to education and empowerment. The second being interdisciplinary and problem-based work that goes beyond, as Kendra Klein just put it, the modern nature-culture dichotomy. Urban ecological systems perhaps being one of the most clear examples of this. And that brings me to Detroit, where our keynote speaker works. Previously called the Motor City, it was the destination of urban migration throughout the 20th century. Population of 1.85 million at its peak in the 1950s, now under 800,000. Unemployment near 30%, poverty rate 3 times the national average, median income less than half the national average. It's been declared to be in a state of fiscal emergency. 139 square miles, 40 of which, almost a third, are vacant land. So it represents some of the most pernicious socioeconomic and ecological problems within our society, political, economic, but also in environmental injustice, but also it's the site of progressive activity to confront these issues, such as the more than 1,200 community gardens now in operation in Detroit. Our keynote speaker today epitomizes both these themes in our department and positive changes taking place in Detroit. He has an intense interest in urban community educational development, as well as contributing to an international food sovereignty movement that embraces black farmers across the African diaspora. He was executive director of Ensaroma Institute Public School Academy, one of Detroit's leading African-centered public schools. He served on the board of directors of the Timbuktu Academy of Science and Technology. He's the CEO of Black Star Educational Management. And he's also founder and executive director of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, which operates D-Town Farm, 7-acre urban agricultural site in Detroit. Along with the Food Security Network, he led efforts to establish the Detroit Food Policy Council, which he also chaired. He's been a member of the Michigan Food Policy Council, and serves on the steering committee of the Undoing Racism in the Detroit Food System. He's currently an Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy Food and Community Fellow. And on a more personal level, he is a father of 3, a musician who plays guitar, bass, and drums. He's traveled to Ghana, Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Cote d'Ivoire, Jamaica, and the US Virgin Islands. So my apologies to Malik. I kind of got excited about doing all this background and whatnot in this intro. Much ado, but certainly about something. So with no further ado, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Malik Yakini.
Okay, good afternoon. How's everyone doing? Good. It's wonderful to be here in Berkeley, which sometimes I call Foodie Central. Congratulations to all the doctoral students who are finishing your studies here, and I hope you go on to do great things to benefit humanity. I always like to begin by giving praise to the Creator. For me, the work that I do is a spiritual work. And so I always start with that, and I'll also start with giving honor to my ancestors, both those in my personal bloodline, in my own family bloodline, and those who African American people share collectively. So I do those things so that I can kind of have a platform to stand on that allows me to be bold and fearless. I'd like to thank Hekia for inviting me and for making sure all my accommodations were in order and checking with me and making sure I had all the details I needed to get here in one piece. I also like to always think, there's people behind the scenes who do all the work that makes things like this happen, and you never really see their faces, but the folks who set up the podium and make sure the sound is working, and make sure the food is here, and prepare the food and clean up after we leave. So I want to recognize those folks also and thank them for their contribution to this program today. I also want to give big ups to all the growers who are in the house. How many people here are farmers or gardeners? If you are, throw your hands up. Don't be ashamed. So I want to thank those folks. And the reason I always do that is because I visited Mali several years ago and was with a small group. We were traveling in a van, about 7 of us, and we saw an elder sitting on the side of the road who we stopped to talk with. And after we talked to him, he said, you've got to go across the road and greet the farmer. And he said the reason you have to greet the farmer is because it's those who work in the sun who make it possible for those who work in the shade. So we have this tremendous debt to farmers. So I always like to recognize those who are growing our food. And finally, I'd like to recognize my friend and comrade and fellow in the IATP Food and Community Fellowship, Dr. Raj Patel. I won't say anything. So I want to bring you greetings from Detroit, where about a month ago, democracy was put into a very deep coma when the governor of our state appointed an emergency manager whose powers supersede those of the elected officials in the city of Detroit. So effectively in Detroit, we are operating under a dictatorship right now. And whenever I have the chance to speak to audiences nationally, I always like to make folks aware of that, because we think it's a serious threat to democracy, and that if it happens in Detroit, which it has happened in Detroit, that the possibility of that happening elsewhere also exists. But I'm also proud to say that Detroit has a very long history of resistance to oppression, and there's a great deal of resistance to the imposition of this emergency manager. So please keep your ears and eyes open for developments in Detroit. I'd also like to bring you greetings from the two organizations that I represent, the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network and the Detroit Food Policy Council. Now, I haven't said all that. I know we're in a very prestigious institution of higher learning, and we've got people with PhDs and folks who will soon have PhDs. But do you all like stories?
Yes.
Great. And this is a story where you have to participate. And so let's just practice the part that you'll do. Please repeat after me. And she did.
And she did.
Beautiful. Okay, so when it's your time, just remember that. That's what you'll say. This is actually a story you may have heard before. It's called The Little Red Hen. But I call this a classic story retold. Your face is so familiar. You, do I know you? Yes, you.
Oh, yeah, I met you at Detroit.
Okay. I don't always remember names, but I usually remember faces.
Yes, she did.
Once upon a time in a village in Africa, a hen scratched about the yard until she uncovered some grains of wheat. She called to her neighbors and said, if we plant this wheat, we will have bread to eat. Who will help me plant it? Not I, said the cow. I thought slavery was over. I always have to stop and explain this. This is not good when you have jokes that you have to explain. But working with African American children in agriculture, typically within the first 15 minutes, there's some reference made to slavery. Either you're working me like a slave or, something like that. So, just to put that joke in context. Not I, said the goat, it probably won't grow anyway. Not I, said the duck, I'm much too busy. Not I, said the lamb, I don't do dirt. Then I will, said the little red hen.
And she did.
Perfect. After a few months, the wheat grew tall and ripened into golden grains reaching up toward the sun. Beneficial insects and beautiful birds began to return to the village. The little red hen again called to her neighbors. Who will help me harvest the wheat? Not I, said the cow. My stomach's ache. Not I, said the goat. I really don't get involved with groups. Not I, said the duck. I have a wheat allergy. Not I, said the lamb. My favorite rapper, Young Shepherd, is performing in a big concert. Then I will harvest it myself, said the little red hen.
And she did.
The hen carried the wheat back to her house and asked her neighbors, who will help me grind the wheat into flour? Not I, said the cow. I already have 2 jobs. Not I, said the goat. I don't have anyone to watch my kids. Not I, said the duck, I'm trying to get paid. Not I, said the lamb, you running game, hen, you trying to pull the wool over my eyes. Then I will grind it myself, said the little red hen.
And she did.
After resting from the exhausting work of grinding the grain, the little red hen made one last attempt to solicit the help of her neighbors. Who will help me make this flour into dough and bake the bread? She was met with the usual litany of excuses. Not I, said the cow, chewing cud takes all the energy I've got. Not I, said the goat, my kids have music lessons. Not I, said the duck, my cousin Donald and his family are visiting from out of town. This is admittedly corny, okay? Not I, said the lamb, I'm studying for my real estate license. Then I will bake the bread myself, said the little red hen.
And she did.
As the aroma of the freshly baked bread drifted into the village, the little red hen's neighbors began to gather outside of her door. Who will help me eat the bread? Asked the little red hen. I will, said the cow. I will, said the goat. I will, said the duck. I will, said the lamb. No, you won't, said the little red hen. None of you practiced ujima, collective work and responsibility. However, my beloved neighbors, I didn't grind all of the grain. I started a seed bank to have wheat for next year. Here's a handful of grain for each of you. And she sent them packing. As the little red hen sat down to enjoy her still warm bread with honey from the beehives that her friend Abba maintained at a local farm, the cow, the goat, the duck, and the lamb called a meeting to form an organic, sustainable farming collective. The next season, they all worked together to plant, harvest, and grind their wheat and bake bread. There was plenty for all. They donated some to the animals who were homeless or sick, and sold the surplus at farmers markets in neighboring villages. Their village continued to prosper, and eventually started manufacturing farming and baking equipment. The little red hen was elected chief of the village council. A little different than the presentations you've heard earlier today, I'm sure. I always like to begin with something to kind of loosen people up, because the rest of what I'm going to talk about is pretty hardcore. And so it kind of helps sometimes that people are relaxed when we start talking about heavy issues like white supremacy. So we have a tremendous opportunity in this country right now to create a just and sustainable food system. And for whatever reason, the stars seem to be aligned right now. There's great interest in food and in creating a more fair food system all the way from the White House. Well, at least we have a garden at the White House, let's say that. There's some other things happening like Walmart and what have you. But there's great interest all the way from the White House to every local community. And so I had the chance to travel throughout the country. Wherever I go, there's some projects where there's sustainable agriculture taking place in farmers markets throughout the country, and food co-ops, and people concerned about pesticides in their food. And so there's tremendous interest in this, and we have the opportunity to create this fair and just food system. It's the view of our organization that in order to create a fair and just food system, that we have to lead with values. And first and foremost among those values are justice and equity. In fact, we say that nothing can supersede justice and equity. Sometimes people make the argument that efficiency or expediency or profit have to supersede justice and equity. And we say that nothing is more important. In fact, that has to be the lens that guides our work. But also within this food movement, we're concerned about creating democracy. And when I say democracy, I don't mean the kind of electoral politics that we often think about when we think about democracy, where we can vote for Tweedledum or Tweedledummer. but a real kind of people's democracy on a grassroots level where within our organizations, we're structuring them in a way that people really have a say-so in what happens in those organizations, and we create kind of a microcosm for the type of society that we're trying to bring into being. Also, in addition to justice, equity, and democracy, one of the values that we think is important is a Kiswahili word which is called kujichagulia. And kujichagulia means self-determination. And so we affirm the right of every community to decide on their own what is in their best interest and create the systems that serve those interests and aspirations, and to not have others come into their communities and impose ideas and systems upon them. And finally, love has to be the overriding value that characterizes everything that we do. But not just the kind of love that we often think about, that we see in movies, but kind of this love for creation that grows from really an understanding of the oneness of humanity, but also the oneness of humanity with the earth, and the oneness of humanity with the earth and the animals and the plants with which we co-inhabit the planet. And so that really grows from this understanding that everything is interconnected and that our actions have an impact on everything else. And so it's this more universal love that we're talking about that we think is very important, that guides our movement. But there's some real serious structural barriers in American society to achieving this fair, just, and sustainable food system. And the largest among those is the fact that we live in a system of unbridled capitalism, where profit is the motive for just about everything in the United States. And this unbridled system of capitalism has created sharp class divisions where, as the Occupy movement has made popularly known, 1% of the population controls the vast majority of the wealth. In fact, that 1% of the population controls more wealth than the rest of us combined. And so we have persistent poverty in American society that has not effectively been addressed in the last 50 or 60 years, in spite of the many federal programs purportedly designed to do that. In places like Detroit, the system of unbridled capitalism has resulted in the intentional disinvestment in the core city areas where those neighborhoods have been left to languish. Jesse, in his introduction, mentioned that about a third of the geographic footprint of the city is vacant land. Some of the statistics were slightly inaccurate. I just want to just alter those a little bit. He was on track, but in 1950 we had actually 2 million people in the city of Detroit. And according to the 2010 census, we have 713,000. That depopulation of the city was caused in large part by race, by what we call white flight in the late 1950s, 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s. But then also we've had tremendous black middle class flight as people are leaving, trying to get better city services. So we've had this intentional disinvestment in the core cities and intentional investment in the ring of suburbs surrounding cities. In those core cities, the poor become markets to almost dump goods, which are often inferior goods. And in cities like Detroit, where we have no national chain supermarkets, we're left with a series of independently owned grocery stores, which often sell food which is of inferior quality, and often at inflated prices. And many times we find that we even have food that's being sold that's outdated, where store owners have put labels over the date that it has expired, and that food is being sold to people in neighborhoods. We also have, as a result of this system of unbridled capitalism, the privatization of what some people call the commons. And in Detroit, where we have about 43 square miles, which is vacant land, and again, about a third of the footprint of the city, there's tremendous competition right now for who will control that land, who will own it. And so just as we have land grabs in Mozambique and Ethiopia and places throughout the world, where large-scale multinational corporations are moving in to control large amounts of land to grow food for the Western world, we see in Detroit kind of a scramble for this vacant land. Most recently in December, there was a huge battle in the city of Detroit against a proposal by a wealthy Detroiter named John Hens to purchase about 1,700 lots of city-owned, publicly owned land at about $300 per lot, or what equated to 8 cents per square foot. Many of us opposed that sale. We thought it was a very dangerous precedent, and we did tremendous community organizing. We're able to pressure the Detroit City Council into having a public hearing where more than 400 people showed up and expressed their displeasure with this proposed sale. But unfortunately, the next day, 5 of the 9 city council members in Detroit voted in favor of this sale, so that this one individual controls a large swath of the Lower East Side of Detroit. And so we think that's just the first kind of shot in an ongoing battle to see who will control this land in the city of Detroit. And we are concerned that the people of Detroit lose when we begin to look at land as a commodity that can be sold to the highest bidder. Well, in this case, it was sold perhaps to the lowest bidder. John Hens said that his reason for wanting to buy this land was to create scarcity, to drive the value of the land up. Yeah, he said it straight up. I mean, this is his words. In fact, you can go online if you look up John Hens at the University of Michigan Dearborn. In I think 2011, he gave a talk where he said this. I had the opportunity to have breakfast with him one day last year and to be able to look him in the eye and ask him a few questions. And he said for him this was a legacy project that he was creating for his daughter. So initially, he said that he wanted to create the world's largest urban farm. He got lots and lots of pushback because of the potential use of pesticides. He wasn't committed to organic agriculture. So folks in neighborhoods were saying they didn't want those chemicals. In the neighborhoods, there was lots and lots of pushback, so his plan morphed into what he called Hants Woodlands, where he wants to plant hardwood trees on the east side of Detroit. But we think all of that's just really the cover story for his real intention, which is to take control of the land, to drive the value up, and to make profit at some point in the future. And again, it sets a dangerous precedent because now we stand in a situation where potentially in 20, 30 years, 2 or 3 wealthy people could control a third of the city. And so, again, as Detroit goes, often the rest of the nation goes. And so we're fighting back against that. And we would encourage people throughout the United States to fight back against similar land grabs and to adopt the understanding that really land is not a commodity. Land is here for our common use. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that we've been duped. The idea of private property, we have been duped into believing that. And it's something that comes to us that's a result of European colonialism, where those who came to the Western Hemisphere from England and France and Spain came from feudal societies where you had landlords who had enclosed the commons and had taken control of the land and pretty much put everyone else off the land so that we become wage slaves to those who own the land. Land is really the basis of power because it's from the land that not only we produce food, but also that we extract the mineral resources upon which modern industrial societies are built. And it's on the land that we build houses, and it's on the land that we build a sense of community. And so we think that the #1 cause of food insecurity in the world is people being dispossessed of their land. And so this is a social justice issue. It's the most difficult, perhaps, of the social justice issues because to make it right would really turn the Western world on its head. But if we have to look at this issue of land and who owns it and who controls it and who benefits from it. And so we're kind of at ground zero in that struggle to retake the commons. But also this privatization of the commons takes the form of destroying the public school system and of privatizing public services so that wealthy individuals and corporations can continue to make profit from our collective need. One of the other major barriers, structural barriers to a just and equitable food system, and let me say this, that it's our view that a just and equitable food system is not separate or distinct from having justice and equity in the society in general. In fact, the injustice and inequity in the food system is simply a symptom of a society which is unjust overall. And so we don't see the struggle to create a just and equitable food system as being separate from the struggle to create a just and equitable society. But one of the other structural barriers is that of gender inequality. And I often like to own my own stuff and tell people that I am a reforming chauvinist. And I'm much better than I was 30 years ago when I started on this journey. But the women around me remind me constantly that I still have quite a ways to go. And I'm thankful for those reminders because it helps me to grow. But we still live in a society where in many communities, women are the bedrock of the community. And certainly in farming throughout the world, the majority of farmers are women, particularly in so-called developing countries where often men go off to the cities to gain employment and women are left in the countrysides to maintain the farms. And so we have to really lift up women and the role that they play. We also, though, recognize that today in America, that there's still unequal pay for women performing the same work as men. And we also recognize that the contributions that women make to the development of homes and families are not valued in the same way that the work outside of the home is valued. We know also that women continue to be subjected to various chauvinistic and patriarchal comments and actions which devalue them. One of the reasons that I am a reforming chauvinist, and I say reforming because, again, I'm in process, and I will be in process for the rest of my life, because it's impossible to be a man in a society and not be infected by patriarchy and chauvinism and these other kind of backwards ideas. And so I'm owning it, and I'm working on it, and I would encourage other men in the audience to do the same thing. But one of the reasons it's important is not only because it underdevelops women, and when women are underdeveloped, the entire society is underdeveloped, but also because it underdevelops men, because we don't recognize and embrace the feminine energy within inside of us. And so we can't be whole, and we can't create balanced human beings and create a balanced society without men embracing and recognizing the value of the feminine energy within inside of us. I wouldn't even go so far as to say that if we had more women leaders in the world, that we would see much less war. You know, testosterone could be a dangerous thing. So in addition to unbridled capitalism and gender inequities, the third major structural barrier to inequality, barrier to equality, to equity and justice in American society is racism. And I really prefer to use the term white supremacy because it's much more pointed. Sometimes when we use the term racism, you know, people feel comfortable with that. And so I want people to feel a little uncomfortable. And you know, I've learned as I speak to audiences that have people in them who identify themselves as white, I've tried to learn how to create a balance and not speak in a way that causes people to shut down. That's what happened. For many years, I spoke exclusively to African American audiences. And so talking about white supremacy to an African American audience is much different. So when I first started talking to audiences that had lots of whites in them, all the white people would just shut down. They wouldn't hear anything I was saying. So I've tried to learn how to frame it now in a way that people hear what I'm saying. But nonetheless, there has to be a certain amount of discomfort for growth. So I prefer the term white supremacy as opposed to just racism, because white supremacy is more pointed. But white supremacy is rooted in history, and it's rooted in the conquest, really, of the entire planet by people from Portugal and Spain and Germany and France and England and Belgium, beginning with Prince Henry the Navigator, who initially was trying to find a way around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. And Europeans who came to West Africa and started as traders, and then decided that they wanted to actually control the land and control the resources, and eventually to steal human beings and bring them to the Western Hemisphere to serve as forced laborers for the development of the Western economy, which still the Western economy has a tremendous debt to people of African descent who served as free laborers for 200 some years and provided the foundation for the economy of the Western world. There's an excellent book that you might want to pick up, which is called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. Rodney was the economist from Guyana in South America. And in that book, he shares a profound understanding of how Western imperialism underdeveloped the African continent and overdeveloped the Western world. So accompanying this moving out into all the continents of the world and colonizing the lands and the people of the various continents came this myth of white supremacy, this myth that people with white skin and straighter hair and often blue eyes were superior to people of color throughout the world. And this myth was used to justify the exploitation and the domination of people of color throughout the world. And so, accompanying kind of this myth of superiority of Europeans is what we call Eurocentrism. This idea that the eyes, the lens through which Europeans look at the world should be the universal lens through which everyone looks at the world. And so we have been, again, duped into measuring time by using European constructs. For example, today is what day of the week? Friday, right? Yesterday was Thor's Day. The day before that was Woden's Day. So why are we accepting this, that we're calling days of the week after European gods and goddesses? Why? Most of us don't even question that. I know you all have because you're PhD students, right? But most of the rest of the society has not really questioned those things. And so we've been duped into believing these things, and so the very eyes that we view the world from are the eyes of the people who have colonized us. And so part of how a system of exploitation and domination is maintained is by colonizing the minds of the oppressed. But by necessity, when you colonize the minds of the oppressed, you also colonize the minds of the oppressor. And so all of us have been impacted by the system of white supremacy, whether you are a person who identifies as white, or a person who identifies as being of African descent, or another person of color. The way white supremacy impacts us is different, depending on kind of where you stand in relationship to it. For white people, it gives people this kind of sense of confidence that they're the best thing since sliced bread, and that their values and their standards of beauty are the universal values and the universal standards of beauty. So that we have this phenomenon where in West Africa, for example, you have many women who are getting skin cancer because they're using bleaching creams to lighten their beautiful black skin. Or you have, I was told just recently in Asheville last week, that in Japan, the #1 surgery that takes place is the surgery to remove the fold in the eyes of Japanese women in order to make their eyes look more like the eyes of European women. And several years ago, I had a chance to go through an Undoing Racism training, and there was some Latina women in it, and they talked about how their friends were dyeing their beautiful dark hair to make it blonde, to make themselves look more like Europeans. And so people of color are profoundly impacted by this phenomenon we call white supremacy. And it really has a devastating impact when people don't like the skin that they're in and want to be something else. So we have a tremendous amount of work to do in that regard. And I really should have said this before I started talking about race, that I don't believe that race exists as a biological or scientific concept. There's enough information now to disprove that. That we know that human beings share millions of genes in common, and the few genes that we don't share in common are the ones that give us different physical characteristics. So race is not a scientific reality, it's a social construct, a social and political construct But it is a real construct that we have to deal with. We can't ignore it and pretend that it doesn't exist, even though it doesn't have its basis in science. So, in addition to kind of the personal manifestations that I talked about, the internalized sense of inferiority that people of color suffer from, and the internalized sense of superiority that people who are classified as white suffer from, there's also this systemic or this institutional racism that manifests in every system in American society, including within the food system. It manifests within the educational system. I really have to tell you, I was shocked walking through the campus yesterday. I think I saw 5 black students. Perhaps, maybe there was a big black student rally somewhere. And all of the other black students were there. Is that what the case was? So it manifests in the educational systems, it manifests in the medical institutions, it manifests in the criminal injustice system, and certainly manifests in the food system. And so that systemic and institutional racism manifests in regards to policies and practices that, although they may not explicitly be aimed at a specific racial group, the impact is the same. It continues these inequities within the society. So as I'm nearing the end of my talk, I think, I'll probably have to cut it short. Where am I, 15 minutes? Okay. Some steps I want to recommend that we take in terms of how we create racial justice, in particular within the food system. And the first is that all of us who are in favor of justice have to do personal work. As I mentioned, we're all infected by this disease called white supremacy, no matter what your so-called racial classification is. And so it takes work to undo that kind of thinking. And typically that work doesn't happen in institutions like this. Maybe in small pockets within institutions. But typically, there's not institutional commitment to kind of undoing this personal internalization of these either racial inferiority or racial superiority concepts. And so we have to be involved in personal work, but that personal work has to be done in conjunction with others in groups who are also trying to divest themselves of the vestiges of white supremacist thinking. I recommend to everyone they undergo or they participate in anti-racist trainings, and that they do it frequently. And there's a number of groups throughout the country that do that training, such as the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond in New Orleans, or Crossroads Anti-Racist Training in Kalamazoo, Michigan, or DR Works, Dismantling Racism Works, which is based in Georgia. And there's some on the West Coast as well. But it's really eye-opening to go through a training where you really begin to break down and unpack this idea of race, and particularly the idea of whiteness in the society and how whiteness has evolved over time. Because this is not a static concept. You know, everyone who's considered white now wasn't considered white historically. Some people have been let into the white club, right? So that, for real. So it has a way of building more power for people who are considered to be white. But one of the consequences of this is that many white people have given up their own ethnicity in order to join this white club and know very little. I've had white people in anti-racist trainings who break down and cry and say, I realize I know nothing about my own heritage, right? Because, you know, they've kind of adopted this generic title of being white. So that has an impact on folks who consider themselves to be white as well. So I'm not really into blaming people or shaming people on that. I don't think that's constructive. But we do have to, you know, really be introspective and engage in this personal and collective work. In addition to that, we need to be committed to challenging systemic and institutional racism at every level in American society, and increasing the Eurocentric, challenging the Eurocentric domination, which is still the order of the day in institutions of higher learning. In fact, it's the order of the day from pre-kindergarten to postdoctoral studies in institutions throughout the United States. So within the food movement, there's some specific things also I recommend. And one is that identify and lift up the stories of African Americans and other people of color who are involved in agriculture and who are involved in food movement work. Because the reality is that right now in the United States, the face of the food movement is a young white woman. And I'm glad that there's lots of young white women doing the work. That's not a criticism of young white women, but there's lots of other people doing the work also. But we don't know about those folks. I just left Asheville, North Carolina last week, where I met people in public housing developments who were doing gardens and organizing people within their communities. We don't know about them. We don't know about Olufemi Lewis in the Hillcrest housing development in Asheville, North Carolina. We don't know about folks in Kelvin Gradit in Hamilton, Georgia, who's reviving the West Georgia Farmers Co-op that his grandfather and grandmother created. We don't know about folks like the folks in Kansas City, Kansas, who are doing small community gardens and organizing their neighborhoods. So we need to identify those organizations and those leaders who are doing that work and lift them up and make their stories known on a national basis. And we need to support those folks. We need to support efforts that exist, such as Growing Power's Growing Food and Justice Initiative, which is designed to kind of create equity within the food system, and the efforts of the Federation of Southern Co-ops and the efforts of Cynthia Hayes and the Southeastern African American Farmers Organic Network. We need to support the efforts of LaDonna Redmond, who's creating a new organization called Food Justice Now, where she aims to get each of the 28 million people who are receiving SNAP benefits to put in $1 to fund this work so that we can move past the limitations of 501c3 organizations. We need to support the work of Maria Whitaker in Kansas City, Missouri, who's creating a national black food and ag organization. We need to support the work of scholars who are identifying the history of African Americans involved in agriculture and lifting up the stories, the foodways, reviving the foodways of African Americans, such as Dr. Monica White and Dr. Kwasi Densu and Dr. Owusu Bandele. And we need to support the efforts of Asian Americans who are lifting up their stories, and support the efforts of Latinos and Latinas who are lifting up their stories, so that we know, so that those stories are represented within the food movement fully. We also need those organizations to dig deeper and broader in the communities that they represent, so that we're actually motivating and activating people within communities of color to be participants in this food movement, so that those who are most severely impacted by food insecurity and food injustice are the ones who are actually leading the movement. At all food-related conferences, and there's enough food-related conferences now that I could do nothing else but travel from conference to conference each week. So at every food-related conference, we need a track on racism within the food system, so that we have multiple workshops that are exposing people to the various ways in which racism manifests within the food system. Within food-related organizations, we need an intentional effort to hire people of color, particularly in executive and leadership positions. We should support the efforts of folks like Cheryl Danley, who are recruiting young people of color to not work for Monsanto and Cargill and ADM, who are being trained in universities in food system work, but who are to recruit them to work for sustainable agriculture and for food justice. And every food-related organization should be doing frequent and mandatory anti-racist trainings. Funders also have a role to play in this, and I would say that funders need to reassess their grant making and employ an intentional strategy to lift up and help build the capacity of people of color-led organizations. Because what we see throughout this country is that the majority of the work being done for food justice and food insecurity and food sovereignty is being done in the communities where people of color are the main residents. But the people doing the work are largely people who are employed by large nonprofit organizations run by whites. And so we have a real imbalance, because if those whites have not gone through a process to divest themselves of the vestiges of white supremacist thinking, they come in almost like missionaries, assuming that they know not only what's best for themselves, but they know what's best for the communities that they're working in. And both of those assumptions are often wrong. And so we need people within communities to lead the movement for themselves And so that means that we have to build the capacity of organizations that are led by people of color to do that work. You know, nonprofit funders often are most comfortable funding people who look like them, who speak like them, who know the people they know, who go the places they go. And so it continues this pattern of historical inequity where we have large, well-funded nonprofits getting the lion's share of funding to do work in communities that are called at risk, marginalized, and various other terms that I use to describe the situation that oppressed people find themselves in. So I would like in the last couple of minutes I have left to share with you some of the work that we're doing in Detroit. I mentioned at the onset that I'm representing the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, and we do many things in the city of Detroit, but the largest and most labor-intensive project we have is called D-Town Farm. Is there something I need to do to get this? Oh, there it is. So the largest and most labor-intensive project is called D-Town Farm. We do many other things, such as the Food Warriors Youth Development Program, where we teach about 200 young people in Detroit about sustainable agriculture and help them to look at the food system in their own communities through a more critical lens. We have a food co-op buying club, which currently is a once-a-month buying club where people can obtain food at below retail prices by buying collectively. And we're working very hard to morph that into a brick-and-mortar retail food co-op. And we also have a lecture series that we co-sponsor with the Detroit Public Library. But the largest project that we're doing right now is D-Town Farm. So our organization was founded in 2006, and we were founded because we looked around the country and saw that, you know, as I mentioned, most of this work was being led by white nonprofits, and certainly in a city like Detroit, which is more than 80% African American, we found it totally unacceptable that large white nonprofits were leading the food movement. And so we formed in 2006 to make sure that African Americans not only had a voice within that movement, but that we were leading the movement in Detroit. So there's many groups, in all fairness, doing food security and food justice and food sovereignty work in the city of Detroit. But the factor that distinguishes our group from many of those other groups is our belief that the most effective movements grow organically out of the communities that they're designed to serve. So one of our early goals was to create a 2-acre organic farm in the city of Detroit. And we said 2 acres because at that time the kind of prevailing wisdom was the difference between a garden and a farm was 2 acres. I don't know how valid that is, but that was our thinking at that time, so we wanted to make sure we had at least 2 acres so we could say we actually have a farm. In 2006, we started with our first agricultural project on about a 1/4 acre on Detroit's east side, and we actually had no authorization to be on that land, and so at the end of that growing season, a developer bought it, and we were gone. And so this is a picture actually from our first year. There used to be houses there, and many of those houses were torn down after the 1967 rebellion, or what some people call a riot in Detroit. So we started trying to till the land, and we ran into old refrigerator parts and cinder blocks and all kinds of things, and we realized that wasn't going to work. So we started using the lasagna method to create these 3-foot wide by about 12-foot long beds, using compost and topsoil, putting newspaper down first, and then putting layers of compost and topsoil on top of that. So we had a really vibrant garden that people were very impressed by. We were able to really transform this area very quickly. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, the developer bought it. We had to move at the end of that season. In 2007, we had a 1/2 acre plot on the west side of Detroit that was owned by a church. The church had formerly farmed it, but the primary farmer had a stroke and wasn't able to use it. They offered it to us. We grew there in 2007. Unfortunately, in March of 2008, I got a call from the church saying that they had other plans for it. So we were at the beginning of the growing season in 2008 with no place to grow. Fortunately, we had been negotiating with the city of Detroit for 2 years prior to that for 2 acres of land, and we got the go-ahead in June of 2008 to begin growing in the city's largest park, Rouge Park, in an area that had formerly been a tree nursery, Myers Tree Nursery. And this is a really interesting story because in 2008, in the city of Detroit, the members of the city council were all often calling each other names in the council chambers. There were people being indicted by the federal government. And as it turned out, the person who gave us authorization to begin growing was the high school buddy of our mayor at the time, Kwame Kilpatrick. And so about a month after he gave us the verbal authorization to begin growing there, he was out of his position. He was an appointee. And as it turns out, many of the appointees were high school buddies of the mayor. So we were on this land with the verbal authorization of somebody who was no longer in the position. So that was a precarious position, but we forged ahead. So the picture you see on your right is Nephara Barber, who was our first farm manager, and this is what the area looked like prior to us beginning growing there. And we chose that area because, again, it was a tree nursery, and there were rows of trees, so there was this wide swath of land in between two rows of trees. We thought that was inviting because we didn't want to have to cut down trees if we could avoid it, and so we just had to cut down waist-high grass and some small shrubs in order to prepare the land for growing. So we eventually, in October that year, got a 10-year license agreement, so we do have some written authorization actually to be there now. In November of 2011, we had some very smart attorneys who negotiated with the city to get us an additional 5 acres. So we now have a total of 7 acres, making us the largest farm in the city of Detroit. But I always have to caution that bigger doesn't necessarily mean better, because there are some very big concerns who want to come in and do farming in the city of Detroit. And we have concerns about the scale that they're proposing and the lack of community ownership, the lack of community empowerment, and the lack of commitment to organic agriculture. We grow more than 30 different fruits and vegetables at D-Town Farm. I don't know if this is true, but people claim the collards from D-Town Farm are the sweetest collards in the city of Detroit. So I don't know that to be a fact, but I'm kind of accepting that. We also grow watermelons and cabbage and spinach and all kinds of other things. We raise bees for pollination and for honey production. We grow mushrooms. We have large-scale composting. On the left-hand side, you see what I often say is the most photographed compost bin in the city of Detroit. We started out with compost bins made out of pallets, but because we're part of a Regional Outreach Training Center for Growing Power, Will Allen challenged us to do a large-scale composting operation, which we're currently doing. And in fact, I think the photo on your left is the day we started, kind of those large windrows that we're composting now. So we have an agreement with a group called Forgotten Harvest, which is the largest food rescue operation in southeastern Michigan, and every week they bring between 10 and 15,000 tons of food waste to our farm. We have another agreement with the county forestry department who brings wood chips, and we use the food waste for the nitrogen and the wood chips for the carbon. And we combine those and turn the piles every 2 or 3 weeks with the tractor and produce this very rich compost that we use to fertilize our crops. We also have 3 large hoop houses that we use for season extension, and the hoop house on your, what's that, your left? Is that your left? Yeah. Is one that's called Rolling Thunder, and it's called Rolling Thunder because it's on rails and wheels, and so you can plant, and when the initial planting gets to a certain level of maturation, you can roll it to position 2 and plant again. So we found out about this from L.A. Coleman, and once we heard about it, everyone wanted one of these. So you can kind of see the rails. In fact, what we did is we had to put the hoop house in position 2. We built the beds, which you can see there in the foreground, and then we rolled the hoop house on top of the beds. The other picture is another of our hoop houses, and this was in November of last year. And so in Detroit has fiercely cold winters. So in November of last year, when farmers who were planting in the ground without season extension technology had nothing growing, we had fresh greens that we were still able to harvest. We do a great deal of agritourism because in addition to being a production farm, we're also a model farm showing Detroiters and others throughout the country the great potential that urban agriculture has, not only to increase the amount of fresh, locally grown food, but also to stimulate local economies. And so we have thousands of people who visit our farm each year. And we give tours talking about social justice, talking about various growing techniques. And so many Detroiters for the first time are exposed to farming at D-Town Farm. So many people have breakthroughs like this young person here holding a worm. For lots of people, just holding an earthworm is a real breakthrough. Although for this person, it was only a partial breakthrough because they had on these rubber gloves. Each year we sponsor a harvest festival in September. We have hundreds of people who attend our harvest festival. This past year we had Will Allen as a keynote speaker, and Brian Terry came out, and we had live music. And so we're really trying to make this an event that attracts people to this urban farm, to expose them again to the great potential of urban agriculture. This past year, we installed water lines. Prior to installing water lines, we had to water the farm using fire hoses. And I have a new respect for firefighters. After dragging a fire hose full of water several hundred feet, it's no joke, believe me. And so now we have underground water lines that are frost-free below the frost lines so that we have water throughout the year. So that was a huge step forward. We're also installing a water harvesting system to capture water that floods on the eastern end of our farm and store it in underground tanks, and using solar pumps to pump it to the rest of the farm so that we can make the best use of the natural rainwater which occurs. And then we have 10 solar panels that we have yet to install, but we're hoping to do that within the next few months so that we have some electricity at the farm. Currently, we have no electricity at the farm. I mentioned that we're a regional outreach training center for growing power, and this picture is Will Allen and his staff. Will is the guy in the center of the photo in the blue sweatshirt with the hat on, and some of the other staff members from Growing Power came with him. And so we constructed the frame for one of the hoop houses as part of this training. And so folks are able to come out, work directly with the staff of Growing Power, and learn how to do things like construct hoop houses, or learn about vermi composting, or learn about traditional composting from Will Allen, while at the same time they assist us in moving forward on one of the many projects that we're doing at D-Town Farm. We sell our food primarily at farmers markets in the city of Detroit, at 4 farmers markets, and we also sell to a couple of restaurants and to a couple of retail stores in the city, and we sell at the farm directly on Saturday and Sunday mornings. So this is some of our kale, which has become my favorite vegetable. Growing up, the only kind of greens I know about were collards, mustards, and turnips, which are kind of like the standard greens in African American communities. But now I have to say that kale is my absolute favorite food in the world. We have a full-time farm manager. We have a part-time compost manager. We have 10 summer interns that we're able to pay $10 an hour, which is not a tremendous amount, but it's it's something to allow them to survive on. And while they're getting trained not only in the techniques of urban agriculture, but also getting trained in the social justice lens that our work proceeds from. We have volunteer crew leaders. I serve as the crew leader on Saturday mornings. We have lots and lots of volunteers that come out on Saturdays and Sundays. Typically on a spring Saturday morning, we'll have 25 to 30 volunteers who come out, and that's how we get much of our work done. So the picture in the lower part of the screen is a circle. We always end our Saturday workday with a circle where we debrief on what people's experience was like at the farm. So there's a couple of websites I want to refer you to. One is my personal website, www.beblackandgreen.com. And so as part of my fellowship with AITP, what I did for the last 2 years is travel around the country with a video camera and documented black farmers and gardeners and food activists, and put those videos on the website. Although I have to say I have more in the can that I haven't edited than I have on the website. So you have to check it frequently because I'm constantly adding things to it. There's also a blog on the website where from time to time I'll write things, opinions on various aspects of the food movement and the food system. Also, I want to invite you to check out the Detroit Food Policy Council's website, and particularly to check out the annual report, which is available online. This is a hard copy of it. This is the 2011-2012 Detroit Food System Report. We do this report every year. This is the second publication, the second year we've done this publication. The first year was a very data-dense publication, which academics and policy wonks love, but it wasn't accessible to other folks. And so this year we're relying more on stories and narratives, and then we'll do this type of policy report every 2 years, and then every third year we'll do the more data-dense report. So we're trying to kind of strike a balance so that we're reaching all of the key players. So both this year and last year's report is available on the Detroit Food Policy Council's website. And then finally, if you want more information on the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, I would invite you to visit our site, www.detroitblackfoodsecurity.org. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on Tumblr, we're all over the place. So I do want to end by saying that yesterday, the federal government in the state of New Jersey increased the bounty on Sister Assata Shakur. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Assata Shakur, but she was a member of the Black Panther Party and a member of the Black Liberation Movement, the Black Liberation Army, who's been in exile in Cuba for the last 30 years or so. And many of us uphold her as a freedom fighter. And the United States government yesterday said she's on the 10 most wanted terrorist list. And there's a frenzy of activity now around trying to get the Cuban government to turn Assata Shakur over. And so I stand with the thousands of other people who say hands off Assata. Thank you.
We have like 5-10 minutes for questions before we go to lunch. We'll do lunch for late lunch. Do you want to take your own questions or I can? Yeah.
Jesse.
So what opportunities do you see for integration between the work you do and educational institutions? How can we create more pathways?
Well, research is very important, and but I like what you said about tying the research to concrete things that are going on. So I think identifying problems that urban farms are having, or rural farms, and finding out what specific things can be researched that will help move our work forward would be important. We have lots and lots and lots of people who research us, and we're starting to push back on some of that. In fact, we're starting to look at this thing called research justice, because often the research that's being done on us is not really beneficial to us. It helps people get letters behind their names and publish things and all that kind of stuff, but it doesn't really concretely help the people doing the farming. And so we're looking at how we can create reciprocal relationships with researchers. So, finding out kind of the points that urban farmers need in order to increase production, in order to increase sales, would be something that's very helpful. So that, right off the top of my head, that would be the most important thing. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, many of the people that do farming in California are not citizens, and that, of course, puts them at great risk for various issues. How do you navigate, immigration reform? Do you have any sort of insights there?
I'm not sure I have any real profound insights except to say that for me, we're currently in northern Mexico. And so I think it's ludicrous to prevent people from coming across the border when really, much of what we now call the United States was Mexico, and like the rest of this land was gangstered from the indigenous population. So clearly I'm in favor of people throughout this continent being able to move freely. I don't know exactly what that looks like, exactly what what bill should be supported. I haven't followed that really closely. But clearly I'm in support of maximum freedom for people who are doing the work that's growing our food. And I didn't talk about workers within the food system, but clearly that's a large concern of mine, that many of the people doing the work to produce our food are subjected to inhumane, dangerous conditions, and because many times they are undocumented, are treated very unfairly. And so I am totally opposed to that, and I'm in favor of justice for those workers and creating as much latitude for people to earn a living and have a prosperous life as possible. Did I mention that Raj Patel is in the house? Yes, sir.
You mentioned something I'm very interested in, which is many times the minds of the oppressed end up being colonized.
Yes.
And many times, paradigm shifts exists much more in intellectual minds than in the real world. Like complete shifts as opposed to reforms tend to be rare. And you also mentioned that what you guys try to do is help the emergence of some sort of really grassroots literature. So I really would like to hear a little more of how you guys are decolonizing your past minds.
Well, one of the things that happens is an oppressive system suggests to us that we don't have the capacity to kind of determine our own destiny. That is the exclusive domain of government or of large corporations, or in some cases of academia. And so part of what we found is just the simple act of people beginning to grow food is tremendously empowering, because it suggests to them we can have some say-so over our own destiny. We can begin to plan what our future is going to look like. And so it rekindles that light. In fact, really what we see ourselves doing is taking back our humanity. And so once people begin to realize that we don't have to be dependent upon government or corporations to live, then people start to think, well, maybe we can educate our own children too. Maybe we can make clothing, right? And these aren't really new ideas, of course, but in the 20th and 21st century in America, they're profound ideas, because we've been rocked to sleep and thinking that we're totally dependent upon these other what we consider to be more powerful entities to supply these things for us. And so both through the action of growing food, but also through our study of history, part of what oppressed people have to do in order to decolonize their minds is to restore their historical memory. An oppressive system seeks to cut people off from their historical memory so that they don't really have an idea of how they got in the situation. And so then they just blame themselves for the situation that they're in. And so by studying history and studying the history of imperialism and colonialism and racism, it gives people a lens to view the current situation that they're in. So kind of those two things, I would say, are the two pillars of our work: the reconnecting our historical memory and instilling within us, or reigniting within us, this flame of our capacity to decide our own future. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Last year, some of my undergraduates did research and discovered that the potatoes for kettle potato chips and the peanuts for, and I forget which brand, were actually harvested by prison labor, which meant that people didn't have to deal with ice grading their farms, and they could take way those wages. I'm wondering, and again, many prisoners are people of color, are those two isolated examples, or is that a trend in industrial food production?
I'm not sure about in industrial food production, but I do know this, that in Michigan, for example, much of the food that's served in universities, in public institutions, is grown by prisoners. Much of the furniture that's produced for colleges and universities in Michigan, and I don't know if that's the case in other states, is built by prisoners. People know, of course, license plates are made in prison, but there's many other things, many other commodities that are produced by imprisoned people. And many people don't know that I think it was the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery in this country, and it said, except for imprisoned. And so, if you read it, it's still there on the books. And so it's legal to use the labor, to exploit the labor of prisoners to produce goods. And then, of course, this occurred a great deal in the South. There's a book out, Slavery, by another name, and I can't recall the author's name, but he documented how in Georgia and other states in the South in the early 1900s, there was a great deal of the use of labor by imprisoned black men primarily, and where they would be farmed out to private interests to work. And oftentimes those men hadn't committed any crime, but they were railroaded if they couldn't produce the proper papers or what have you. But there's lots and lots of documentation of that. So, clearly the prison industrial complex, as we know it now, is something that is another part of this unjust system that we find ourselves in. And so, particularly what we find is that in African American communities and communities of color, that we have young men in particular, and increasingly young women who are being criminalized, and then they're shipped out to prisons in rural areas, in the state of Michigan particularly, which is what my experience is. And so they're shipped to these rural, mostly white areas. So you have prisons who are supporting these rural communities based on housing or imprisoning people of color from distressed urban areas. So it's a very exploitive situation where people are profiting off of the criminalization of young people of color. And then of course we have the whole privatization of prisons also, which is a whole other thing, where then people have the profit motive to continue to put more and more people in prison. And that's one of the largest, one of the fastest increasing sectors within the American economy. Yes, ma'am.
First, I just want to say thank you for your story, because everything you said made my heart sing.
And thank you. I felt your energy as I was talking. So I appreciate it. I always had to find somebody as long as I can connect with you.
I was there. I was with you.
I felt you.
The question I had for you is, I'm wondering, within Detroit, so I think of other organizations that aren't food-based, like the Heidelberg Project, but they're looking for ways to both claim, make visible the African American community on the landscape,
yes.
Do a lot of the things that you were saying, reclaim that history, tell those stories,
yes.
Bring those innovative ideas to building the place in Detroit. Does D-Town Gardens actually form relationships or have relationships with other organizations outside of those doing work on food? Or are you thinking about it?
Well, I want to give a two-part answer. First thing, you mentioned the Heidelberg Project. I got an email just before I came here this morning. Someone set part of the Heidelberg Project on fire.
Yeah.
And it's an art project that Tyree Guyton, a local artist in Detroit, is creating in an area where there were many abandoned houses, and he's painted these houses all kinds and decorated them with found objects. And now it's a destination where people come from throughout the world to visit the Heidelberg Project. The city, in fact, in 1999, they tore the whole thing down, bulldozed it, he built it back up. But it seems like someone else is attacking it again. Let me say this, that most of the formal partnerships our organization has are with other organizations doing food work. But I want to be clear, most of us are activists as individuals and are involved in many aspects of fighting for justice. So although organizationally we're primarily focused on food, the individuals within the organization have all kinds of alliances and are involved in all kinds of organizations, because we don't see this work as being separate from the work of creating justice in general. I saw another hand. Okay. Here somewhere. Yes, ma'am. Here and then over here.
I just seen that you talked about how your mission is primarily about Black self-determination. I'm wondering how you feel about individuals who are not Black contributing to your work or wanting to contribute to your work.
Well, first of all, we stand in solidarity with all oppressed people. Let me say that clearly. But we also make no apology about standing for ourselves. We are unapologetically Black, so we don't, our knees don't wobble when we say that. So we think people should respect that and support that. And if people don't support it, we just keep on pushing. But we stand in solidarity with all oppressed people. So we are for having allies. And so it's not that, we have plenty of white people that come. And sometimes, Saturday when we're trying to get some work done, and some white people, I'm like, yes, white people. But the thing is this, so it's not that, I'm not in favor of like building a wall around the Black community and saying nobody else can come in. And that's not what we're for. But we're for people coming into community in a way that is respectful, and in a way that respects the leadership that exists within that community. So when people come to D-Town Farm, we have people of all different ethnicities that come and volunteer and help us out. And we love that. But they understand that when they're coming, they're supporting a Black community self-determination project. And so if they're able to follow the leadership of Black folks, it works out swell. Now we have some white people that come there, they're not used to following Black leadership. We had one guy who came last year, he was there for about 15 minutes, he wanted to tell us everything that we should do. Oh, you should do this, you should do that, you should do that. It's like, dude, you've been here 15 minutes, we've been out here 4 years, and what makes you think we haven't thought of these things? So there's a certain arrogance that goes along with this unearned privilege that white people have, that, that some people have trouble moving beyond. So for those folks, they have a rough time with us. But for folks who are able to, to come with humility and to, relate to us as fellow human beings without coming trying to dominate, then we have a great time. So I'm all for that, and I'm particularly for Black and brown communities finding ways to unite together, and even poor white communities, because poor white folks in this country are oppressed as well. I think there was one other question here in the back. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on what Jesse had asked about bringing the research to communities, like establishing individual credibility in either spectrum, I guess, especially as like someone who's the classic example of the face of the food movement.
I'm not sure I have a whole lot more to add, except just to say that we're interested in having reciprocal relationships. We're not interested in people coming and do research on us and disappear, and then we see something they've written and they have a publication, they get a, they advance of the career ladder. We're not really interested in that. And so we're interested in looking at how we create justice, within research. So I'm not sure what more I can say about that. I think that's really all the answer I have to that. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Thank you for your eloquence, and
thank you.
I'm resonating with a lot of things you said.
Thank you very much.
I was, as you called yourself a reforming chauvinist,
Yes,
I was wondering if what you would do, maybe if you do, what would you call a gender equity training that would be propagated, throughout your talks around the nation, and how would you start that? Is that an essential part of this transformation of our thought and the races?
I'm not sure what I would call it. So at this point, I'm kind of making sure I put it out there in my talks to make sure that that's in the forefront of people's minds. And again, owning my stuff, right? Because I think that men really have to do that. We're sick. Really, men in this society are ill, and we need healing. And it's similar to the white supremacy paradigm. Once you start believing that stuff, then it's like, you're damaged yourself. So oppression damages both the oppressed and the oppressor. So I'm not sure what, I haven't been through kind of formal gender equity training yet, but for 30 years I've been working on it personally, reflecting, listening to the feedback from others, trying to be more conscious of my use of language, being conscious of roles within the work that we do. In our organization, we have a 3-person board. They're all African-American women. And so that's who I report to. And they're not easy either, let me tell you. In fact, 2 of them have PhDs. I'm not an academic myself, but we have 2 academics. Dr. Monica White is our board president. She ain't easy. And so that feedback helps me to grow. And we're happy. So I don't know exactly what the training might look like, but I'm kind of trying to put these ideas out here in hopes that it gels and that we have a more robust conversation within the food movement about women and about gender inequity and about the feminine energy and about the need for men to heal and to reform ourselves from this kind of testosterone illness that we seem to be suffering from. Yes, sir. Oh, I saw you walking over here, man. You were in front of me. I was like, what's this dude with locks?
Can you speak on the issue of gentrification, right, as it relates to the Hens, tree farming?
Sure. I mentioned that in 1950, Detroit was about 2 million people, and we had this large influx of African Americans in Detroit starting in the 1920s, primarily to work in automobile factories, and that continued through the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And so beginning in the late 1950s, you had this outpouring of white people from the center city and the creation of this ring of suburbs surrounding Detroit. And then you had, as I mentioned, the potential disinvestment in the core city and the investment in those cities surrounding Detroit. You had the creation of infrastructure in the way of freeways so that folks could get from the places they were living in the suburbs into the jobs in the city. And so within that context, black people assume political, I don't know if I want to say power. We assume the political positions, I'll put it like that. We have black faces in high places, although they were still accountable to the Henry Fords and General Motors and the corporate interests. So now we see this trend reversing, and this is the same throughout the country. I just left Washington, D.C. yesterday, which used to be called Chocolate City, and it is definitely not the Washington, D.C. I remember from 20 years ago. So in many communities, you have poor black people who are being pushed out, and young, affluent whites, hipsters, sometimes people call them, moving into these more desirable areas that are in the center of the city and creating these little enclaves. The same thing is true in Asheville, where I just left, I think last week, 2 weeks ago. I'm getting a little confused, I'm traveling so much, where there was a traditional black business area called The Block. And so rich investors came from Massachusetts and New York and bought up that area and pushed out the black folks, and now they created a hip, trendy area where, you know, it's hard to even find a black face. And so in parts of Detroit, the same thing is happening. In fact, they have renamed part of the central city. They call it now Midtown. It used to be called Cass Corridor. So they've renamed it, and this has become kind of what I call gentrification central. And in fact, we have a Whole Foods that's opening in Detroit in about a month, right in that area, which is almost the capstone to the gentrification of that area, once you have a Whole Foods. And I'm not really anti-Whole Foods, don't get me wrong. You might even see me there once or twice. But it's more the context into which they're moving. You know, it's not Whole Foods in and of itself. It's that they're solidifying the gentrification of this neighborhood. So you have lots of young whites who are moving into Detroit. And, you know, again, I'm not for building a wall around the city and say nobody can come in and nobody gets out. That's not the point. In fact, I think part of the revitalization of Detroit is going to involve young whites moving into Detroit, but it's a question of how that's done. And so what we see happening right now in that area, the so-called Midtown area called North Corktown, is that they're given favor over the residents in other areas. For example, in so-called Midtown and North Corktown, they have bike paths. There's no bike paths in my neighborhood. You know, so why is it that folks who come in, now they get all kinds of favor and you know, even sometimes tax breaks, and folks who have stuck it out and been there all the time are left to struggle. That's the problem. And the other problem is many times those whites moving in, because they haven't taken the time to